The Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast is and will always be free to access. But if you would like to support my work, please consider joining my Patreon or signing up on YouTube as a channel member. By doing so, you will receive exclusive benefits, including early access to future podcast episodes, access to hosted discussion groups, and access to non-podcast supplementary videos. So click the join button underneath this video to join as a YouTube channel member, or find the link to my Patreon page in the description. Thank you.
I think the best way to describe me is a Christian philosopher. I wear a lot of hats and I've done a lot of things over the years, but um, in terms of my day-to-day work, I'm the founder and president of a ministry called Convincing Proof. And it's a ministry that focuses on giving reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true. I'm a Christian, evangelical, conservative Christian, and I'm convinced that Christianity is true. And so, like many people who have a certain position on whatever topic it is, I'm advocating for my position and trying to convince other people that it is, in fact, true. And it's more than that. If Christianity is true, then we were all made to have a relationship with God. And so Christianity teaches that our relationship with God has been broken. And the only way back into a right relationship with God is through faith in Christ. And so I spend most of my time trying to encourage people to be reconciled back to God through faith in Christ. But people have, good questions, skeptical questions about how this could be true. And so I really enjoy trying to answer those questions and deal with objections and folks who are arguing against Christianity. So that's my full-time job.
Perfect. Okay, so as I mentioned in the email, I'm not a Christian, nor am I religious in any way. I consider myself more, well, maybe I am religious in terms of religiosity, but in terms of kind of lifestyle and following a particular religion, I'd say I'm certainly not. I'm more spiritual than anything else. I try and follow a kind of a scientific way forward in discovering things, as opposed to a faith-based thing. But I do hold certain beliefs that do align with many of the world's religions. I just don't subscribe to any particular one as in terms of the doctrines of that religion, so to speak. And I've always struggled to logically and morally accept them, I suppose. So, for instance, one of the main issues I find with Christianity and with other religions, which is interesting that they all kind of follow that same idea, at least in the Western world, is the idea that your pathway into either eternal comfort and joy in heaven versus eternal suffering in hell is based solely upon whether you believe or not, as opposed to how you are as a person. Because to me, that seems very, very difficult to reconcile with an all-loving, all-moral being, if you know what I mean. I'm sure you hear that a lot. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that objection.
Yeah. No, I can respect that. I've had similar thoughts throughout the years. So I should say that I became a Christian when I was a teenager. And then throughout my 20s, I was working as an actuary. I worked in the field of actuarial science. Just have that sort of mathematical, analytical, logical thinking mind.
And
And
what
so
is
all
that
throughout my
field,
20s,
actuary science?
actuarial science, yeah, it's called science, but it's technically probably more better considered mathematics. Actuaries are the people who price insurance products. So it's based a lot on statistics and probability. And I had to study a lot of mathematics to be an actuary. And I did that for 10 years after college. But I guess my point was during my time as an actuary, I was a Christian, but I was always kind of wondering these thoughts and pondering, how do we know this stuff is really true? Um, because I don't really see Christianity as like a religious faith. I mean, there's a sense in which it is, but I guess I'm more concerned about believing what is true, what corresponds to reality. So I affirm a correspondence notion of truth. I think something is true if it corresponds to reality, and so I want to know what's really true about reality, the universe, myself. Um, so it's not as much of a religious faith as it is of I became convinced that based on the reasons and evidence, almost like a scientific endeavor, I became convinced based on the reasons and evidence that Christianity is true, that it does correspond to reality. And I know what you mean about, because it does seem, I know, to outsiders, to non-Christians, that it's all based on your belief or not, whether or not you go, as you said, to heaven or to hell. But if Christianity is true, nobody goes to hell because of a lack of belief. So if Christianity is true, people go to hell because of their evil choices. So according to Christianity, we all have made evil choices, some worse than others, right? But all of our evil choices have broken our relationship with God. And so something needs to be done to bring us back into a right relationship with God. And most people have a kind of an intuitive sense that I need to do something to get myself right with God. I need to be nicer to people. I need to do maybe more religious things. Somehow I can work my way back to God. And that's the foundation of a lot of religious belief systems. But Jesus was a little bit different. Jesus, when he appeared on the scene, he, through things like the Sermon on the Mount and a lot of his teaching, he explained what moral perfection looks like. So the Sermon on the Mount is probably Jesus's most famous sermon. You can read that in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Doesn't take 10 or 15 minutes to read it. But if you read the Sermon on the Mount, he sets the bar so high in terms of what moral perfection looks like. And he says that you have to basically be perfect in order to make yourself right with God. And I'm going to guess that the vast majority of people who were there that day that heard that sermon were devastated because we all recognize that we fall short of that perfection. And so, according to Christianity, the solution is, since none of us can work our way back to God because we're all moral failures, God stepped into the picture and did something on our behalf to rescue us. So there's a sense in which he did all the work, right? Sometimes I use the example of, let's say we all had cancer, which almost seems to be true sometimes these days. But if every single human being in the world had a deadly form of cancer, and a doctor um, invented a cure for it, and it was just one little pill that you could take and you'd be cured of this cancer. And he made this cure available for free. Um, so then it was up to you to decide whether to take that pill or not. If you decide not to take that, he's not going to force it on anybody. But if you decide to take that pill, then you'd be cured. If you decide not to take the pill, then you're gonna, the cancer is just going to play out. So it's not as though you'll die then, um, based on the pill. You die because of the cancer. And so if Christianity is true, it's the same thing. We go to hell, which is just an eternal separation from God, that our broken relationship with him stays broken for all eternity. That's basically what hell is. And he allows us to make that choice, or we can take the pill, so to speak, and be cured, i.e., brought into a right relationship with him, forgiven, spend eternity in heaven, however you want to talk about it. And that pill, according to Christianity, is putting our faith in Christ. And when I say faith, it's not this religious leap of
I
faith in the
yeah,
water.
I disagree with a lot of, especially atheists or very strong atheists' idea on what faith is. They often define it as faith just for the sake of believing something or out of fear of believing. But I think faith can and should be reasonable faith. If you have faith in as you say that a certain medication that a doctor prescribes you, will have faith in that doctor's abilities to know that it will work based on the evidence of how good a doctor he is, how many patients he's cared for, etc. So I agree that faith, isn't just a belief without evidence. I think it can be and should be evidence based.
So trust, trust might even be a better word because it doesn't carry that sort of connotation that's come from a lot of, I could walk you through where that idea of a blind leap of faith came from, but I tend to use the word trust more often because it's trusting something or someone based on good reasons and evidence. And I use marriage often as an example. So I trust my wife, that she's going to be faithful to me and love me unconditionally and be a good supportive spouse. But it's not a blind trust. It's we've been married for over 29 years, and so I'm trusting her based on all sorts of good reasons and evidence of good, having gotten to know her over the last 30 years.
One of the things I wonder is God, in the Christian idea of God, created us with the desire for us to know and love him and be with him. Correct?
Yeah, I would say a lot of that roots back into the very nature of God being a trinity, and I can unpack that more, but go ahead.
Sure.
You were going to ask a question.
Yeah, but the main thing with that is God is an omnipotent, omnipresent being who's capable of anything. So why would he create these beings that he wants to love and be with him for eternity? It's with the potential to do just the opposite.
Yeah.
So in other words, using your analogy, why would God create the cancer in the first place and then need a pill to save us from it? Just don't create the cancer at all. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Mm.
No, I do. Yeah, so I've done quite a bit of work in this area. Oftentimes it arises um, within the issue of the problem of evil. Why is there evil at all? Um, and I've developed a theodicy that I call my divine love theodicy, but it starts with this idea that God is a trinity. So if Christianity is true, then God exists as one being, but three persons, and these three persons exist in a eternal loving communion of three persons, these loving relationships. And so if Christianity is true, then God created us basically to expand that communion, create more persons to love and enjoy loving relationships. I think that's the meaning of life, is enjoying loving relationships with God and with each other, friends, spouses, family, God. So if God created us for that purpose, then it seems like he would have to create us with free will. Because if he just created robots, for instance, who had to love him and to love each other, then it doesn't seem to me that that would be true love. We don't want our spouse to love us because they have to, but because they choose to. And so if God is going to create beings with free will, then that opens up the door to choose not to love. And I think that choice is the root of all of our evil choices. Every time we choose to do something evil, it's because we're choosing not to love. So if I'm um, mean or I tell lies about somebody, I'm being unloving. So I would say that's the root of all of our evil is based on that free will choice to choose to love or not to love. And I think that's how evil entered into the equation.
Mm. So my thought pattern there is to use it as an analogy to something that we are more familiar with, say maybe a governing body or entity, or even in a relationship, even closer to home. If one member of the relationship, more than likely the man, if we're being honest, was to say to his wife, you have to love me, or else I'm going to punish you for the rest of our relationship. that to me isn't offering the free choice out of love. That's emotional abuse.
Yeah, I see where you're going. Couple thoughts come to mind. Initially, I think it's important to keep in mind with Christianity. Again, I keep saying if Christianity is true because I want to. This is all of my comments and thoughts are within the framework of Christianity being true. So God then is not only our lover, so to speak, right? Having a loving relationship with Him. He's also the righteous judge of the universe. And so, as the judge, he does have to play a role in terms of making things right. And I think we would expect the God of the universe to hold people accountable. So, you take a Hitler or anybody evil in history, I think it's very intuitive to think that God, as the creator, should hold people like that accountable. And so it makes a lot of sense to me then that God would hold us accountable for our evil choices. And it seems to me that a lot of folks have a misunderstanding of the Christian's conception of hell. I think a lot of folks think of hell as this place of torment and um,
The pit of fire.
fire,
Yeah.
burning. Yeah. But if you look at Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, I think it's Second Thessalonians, the way that and the Bible does use that sort of imagery. And I think that's where these ideas have come from. But I think the Bible uses this sort of imagery to impress upon us how serious a place that hell is. I don't think the torment there is going to be literal physical torment. I think it's going to be more torment in the sense of being separated from God, not having a relationship with Him being the source of all good things. It's going to be that sort of sorrow. And you see that when Paul writes Second Thessalonians, where he's explaining that the worst part about hell is being separated from God. And so that, in a sense, then God is allowing people to choose not to have a relationship with Him. So if He would force that upon people, right? If He would force everybody into heaven, that would almost be like a violation of their free will to force everybody to be in a relationship with Him for all eternity forward, and that's what we would understand heaven to be.
Hmm. I struggle with I suppose the logistics maybe of it. Maybe that's not the right word, but taking what the standard Christian doctrine says, if you've admit your sins and repent in front of God, say at your deathbed, then you will be accepted into heaven. So I struggle to see a man who's been great and loving to everybody and everything on the planet for his whole life, but has never been able to accept Jesus as the Saviour, standing at the gates alongside someone who came to God right at the end of his life, but did so many immoral things throughout his life, will get into heaven and he won't, just because his faith in God at the end of his life seems to make up for all the nonsense that he did in during his life, whereas the good man, just for not believing, maybe he didn't have the capacity to believe or for whatever reason, gets eternally, not for a long time, for eternity, away from God into hell. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It seems very
Oh,
unbalanced.
yeah. No, no, I sympathize with that. In fact, there's somebody very close to me who that's according to him, that is one of the primary reasons that's preventing him to becoming a Christian because of this very issue. So I've wrestled with it. I know people who wrestle with it. So a couple thoughts. I would say, first of all, that there's there's definitely some things about Christianity that I don't even necessarily prefer or like, but my beliefs aren't based on what I prefer or what I like. So if this particular area of Christianity is something that I don't like, that doesn't mean it's necessarily false. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a
Just
lot of
because
things
we
I don't
don't
like
want
about.
something to be true doesn't necessarily mean that it's not.
there's a lot of things I don't like about reality. I don't like gravity sometimes. I'd love to fly around like a bird and enjoy that sort of thing, but I got to deal with what's actually true. So, if Christianity is true, and I think there's good reasons and evidence to believe it is, then it includes some of these things that on some days I might not prefer, but they're still true. The second thought that I have is that there's a sense in which this is actually a beautiful thing, though. So most days I really do like this because what it means is that everybody has the opportunity to be forgiven. No matter what you've done, no matter how horrendous you've been, you've got the opportunity to be forgiven. And I think that is a beautiful thing. So, and then the third thought I was going to say is this idea of the generally good moral person. Um, Again, according to Christianity, God sees everybody's inner life. He sees their heart, their thoughts, their conscience, whatever. And God's evaluation of mankind, when I look out in my neighborhood or my friends and family, I do see folks who seem, at least on the outside, from the little window that I get into their life, as pretty good people. And they're not all Christians. So I know a lot of non Christians who seem to be good, relatively moral people. And based on what I could tell, it doesn't seem like they have any evil whatsoever. But I don't see everybody's thoughts, minds, hearts, what they do behind closed doors, their intentions. God does, again, if Christianity is true. And God's evaluation of mankind is that we are all incredibly evil. And most of the time, when we don't act out on our evil intentions, it's because of the negative consequences. If we had free reign, that classic Greek parable of what if we had a ring that made us invisible. Um, Kind of the moral of that story is if we had a ring that made us invisible, or we could do anything we wanted to do without any consequences, it would really show how evil every single one of us really is. And that's God's evaluation. You read Paul in Romans 3, and it's pretty damning. God's evaluation, the one who can see everybody's heart and mind, how evil we all really are.
Although I would argue that that seems to be a much more subjective thing to the individual in terms of, I mean, everybody will have their own moral code of what's right and wrong. For instance, my mum wouldn't have a problem squashing a spider. I couldn't do that because I couldn't kill any. I hit a hedgehog once when I was driving my car, and I thought about it for the next 3 days, feeling sick. So that didn't come from a religious belief or a fear that if I don't do the right thing or I do bad things that I'm going to be punished for it. It wasn't right. It just felt wrong to do that sort of thing. So for that reason, I struggle to see that it's purely based on faith in Christ or whatever to determine your morals, because I don't follow that idea of Christianity or of Islam or anything in terms of religion, but I still have that sense of what's right and wrong, and I think it would align with most Christians' idea of what's right and wrong.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And this is actually the area of philosophy that I specialize in. So I specialize in metaethics, and it's the idea of what is morality. Most people are familiar with ethics. Is abortion right or wrong? Is same-sex relationships right or wrong? Those are ethical questions. The death penalty, classic ethical debates. But metaethics goes a little bit deeper, and metaethics is trying to answer the questions like, well, where does morality come from? Is morality purely subjective, or are there objective aspects to reality? What is morality? Where does it come from? And I would say, stepping back from Christianity for just a moment, I would say that all of us, Christians, non-Christians, Muslims, atheists, I would say all human beings have built into them some sort of a moral intuition, some sort of moral compass. So what you're describing, not wanting to harm animals in that case, or harm other humans, of course, all of those basic moral intuitions I think are built into us. Now, of course, there's different explanations as to where that built-in moral compass comes from, right? You could talk about it in terms of maybe an atheist or a naturalist would talk about it in terms of evolution, maybe how evolution designed us to have those sort of moral intuitions. That's why we all experience them. Whereas I'm going to argue as a Christian philosopher that Christianity best explains where that internal moral compass comes from. Paul talks about this in Romans 2. He talks about how God's moral law is written on our hearts, every human being. So I think that explains why even non-Christians understand correctly um, many moral truths. I would not be one who would have to argue, or I would not be one that argues that you have to have a Bible or even know about the Bible or know of Christianity or be a Christian to know moral truth correctly, based on Paul's explanation there in Romans 2.
Mm. So in that case, if our moral compass is kind of a divine aspect of us, which I would agree with to some extent, I would also go down the evolutionary route, but in a less specific way. I would say that rather than evolution being a direct cause of our moral compass being developed, I would say that our evolution as humans have allowed us to be more in tune with something that's already there. Perhaps, I don't know, but I'm not. I don't. I am someone who thinks that there was intelligence at the base of life to some degree. I don't know, but I struggle to believe the alternative based on the sheer probabilities and necessary fundamental assumptions have to be made to assume everything arrived through coincidental interactions. You know, um, and so I think there was an intelligence at the base of it. I don't, as I say, I don't necessarily think it to be God in the way that religion would view a God. I think we're all a wave in the ocean of God, I suppose. I suppose maybe you could say I would align with idealism, perhaps, if you know of idealism. Um,
Sounds kind of like pantheism or panentheism.
it could be. I'd never know how to classify myself because I don't really stick to one thing because something could come up and I could change my mind on it. Um,
Labels and categories are so difficult. I prefer people
mm,
just explain what they believe, and then people
yeah,
can
I
label
agree.
us
Yeah,
however they like.
I agree because as soon as you stick a label on something, you have many assumptions that come along with it. So,
Exactly.
but my question was going to be if this moral compass is a divine aspect of us, then why then do many, both religious and non religious individuals, seem to lack any form of morality?
Yeah.
Or hold a very, very different, um, antithetic, I suppose. Is that the right word? Antithetic form of morality.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be outliers, right? There's always going to be, what people might call psychopaths or sociopaths who don't seem to have this sort of moral compass like the rest of us do. I've done a bit of research. I wrote an article for a journal about this issue, specifically psychopaths, and I had to do a bit of research in that field to understand, are these folks really lacking a moral compass completely, or are they just suppressing it? And it's very difficult. I mean, to study that issue because, well, one of the things that makes it difficult is the only information we have to go on is information that the psychopaths tell us. And by definition, psychopaths aren't the most trustworthy people. So in my article, I ended up arguing that no, it's not that they lack a moral compass. They might lack some of the moral emotions that go along with it, but I think it's very difficult to deny that they have no moral compass whatsoever. I think it's more that they're either suppressing it and or that it doesn't work as well, maybe, as the rest of us. And I think that's just a part of the normal human condition, right? We all have different aspects of us that don't work as well as they should. Some people are born with brains that don't work as well. Some people are born with legs that don't work as well. And I don't think there's any reason why somebody might be born with a moral compass that doesn't work as well as it should. So that's the extreme example. That's the outlier, right? The psychopaths. But just in terms of different cultures, I've done a lot of thought and study and writing on this issue too, because sometimes people will say, especially subjectivists or people who are relativists when it comes to morality, they'll say things like, well, look at Oriental cultures compared to Western cultures. They just have that completely different moral compass. Take any example you want. Sometimes I'll use just how to greet another human being. In the West, what are we taught? Look them in the eye, shake their hand, right? In the East, do not look them in the eye and do not touch them, right? Bow. So you might say, well, that's, it's just a completely different moral compass. Well, no, not
I
necessarily,
wouldn't say
because
so. No, I'd say different
no, there's
expression.
differences, different expressions of, I think, something underlying both greeting customs or greeting traditions, and that is human beings have value, and so you should greet them and give them honor when you meet them. And yeah, different cultures are going to do that differently, but I think there's some underlying um, basic, absolute, objective moral principles that we all know about through this process. I would like to go back to evolution, though, if you don't mind. I thought you said something pretty insightful when it comes to evolution.
In terms of intelligence being at the base.
Yeah, so I'll do this real quick, but when it comes to evolution, this is an internal debate among Christians. So some Christians believe that God used evolutionary processes to create us. Other Christians would say no, God stepped in at different times in the history of the earth with special times where he specially created new life forms. So whether you think God used evolution or not, um, it doesn't really matter in terms of our moral beliefs, because sometimes people will want to say we can explain all of our moral beliefs through an evolutionary process where nature selected for moral beliefs that work, that help us to function better as a society, because it wouldn't select moral beliefs that wouldn't work. It would select moral beliefs that would cause us to work together better so we could compete against other groups in terms of scarce resources. So that's where all of our moral beliefs come from. You don't need God in the equation at all. And I think that's kind of missing the boat, because um, that that only explains how we came to know of some of these moral truths. It doesn't explain how those moral truths are true. So if evolution did uh, help us come to a lot of true beliefs. You could say evolution helped us to come to a lot of correct beliefs about mathematics. Well, that doesn't mean you can explain away mathematics, right? Just by saying evolution created it. No, it just means that it was a process that helped us to know what mathematical things are true. And again, if evolution did play a part in us developing our moral beliefs, that wouldn't explain them away, because we'd still have to say, well, why are those moral beliefs true? How we came to learn something is different um, than whether or not those things are objectively true and how they can be objectively true. I just wanted to comment on that because I thought what you said was insightful about if our moral beliefs came by evolution, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not correct or true.
Mm. And this is one of the main
Um,
questions with consciousness that no matter who you ask, a lot of people will say one way or the other, well, we know what consciousness is. Either it's a result of information processing in the brain, or it's a spark of the divine within us. And the truth is, we haven't got a clue what consciousness is, and it's the leading question of humanity, and has been for so long for a reason. Because it seems to be so different from everything else that we observe. And in terms of, I mean, what do you think about evolution? Do you believe it, human beings are the result of an evolutionary process?
no, so I would make a distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. I think evolution definitely um, is happening on a micro scale, and that is in terms of just the Mendelssohn type genetics, where certain genes are brought more to the surface based on the environment. So dogs in a colder environment are going to have longer fur than dogs in a warmer environment because of that sort of microevolution taking place within a species. But I would reject the idea that macroevolution is true, i.e., that given enough time, an entire new species develops. I wrote an article about this. I'm not a scientist, and so I'm always hesitant to speak out of my field of expertise. But based on my understanding and research in the science, and based on scientific material that I've tried to study and read and talk to other scientists, I wrote a paper on this issue, making use of a lot of material by William Dembski and Michael Behe. But folks can find that on my website, convincingproof.org, if they want to dive into the details of why I personally reject macroevolution. But this is something that Christians disagree on. There's all sorts of Christians that believe that God used evolution in some sense to develop us. And it's a secondary issue. It's not something that I would, it's not a hill that I would die on.
No, sure.
Sure.
So you mentioned that, and I believe quite rightly, your belief in Christianity is evidence based from the research that you've done and the things that you've found. So, what are the key pieces of evidence that would suggest to you that what Jesus, what is in the Bible as Jesus having said so, is accurate, and the events within the texts are also accurate? What evidence do you have, or do you believe indicates that that is a true statement of the account of Christ?
Yeah, no, that's great. Good question. I will say one more comment about consciousness, because I want to avoid any sort of God of the gaps argument. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because I get accused of that a lot, right? God of the gaps argumentation that, for instance, consciousness. Well, we don't have a great explanation of consciousness, so it must be God, right? And that is a type of argumentation that I think everybody should avoid, right? Christians, non-Christians, we don't want to we don't want to base our beliefs on our lack of knowledge or our lack of explanation and just put a God in there, right? We want to argue, I think, more abductively. In other words, inference to the best explanation, where we would say, hey, based on what we know at this point, it seems like God is the best explanation for whatever phenomenon we're discussing, whether it's the beginning of the universe or the fine tuning of the universe or consciousness. We're not making a God of the gaps argument just because we don't understand something, it must be God. No, based on the phenomenon that we're looking at, it seems like God is the best explanation, at least right now. We might learn other things down the road that would show that it's not necessarily, that God isn't necessarily the best explanation. So I use the example in this topic often of somebody who gets healed by cancer. So let's say my mom doesn't have cancer, just hypothetical example. But let's say my mom had a terrible form of cancer and she was healed tomorrow completely. And the doctors come to us and they say, we don't know how to explain this. Yesterday she had cancer all over throughout her body and now it's all gone. Oftentimes, and I hate to be that guy, but I find that Christians, in that sort of scenario, just immediately want to attribute that to God. And that might be true. I'm not denying that. But there might be some other explanation. And so just immediately attributing it to God, I think, is making that God of the gaps mistake. The alternative would be, let's say we discovered that 3 months ago, somebody had prophesied that yesterday at a specific time, my mom would be completely healed with cancer. And let's also say that her pastor was praying over her yesterday, asking for the cancer to be removed right when it was eradicated. Now, if you have all those other facts involved, I think that would be not necessarily a God of the gaps argument anymore. That would be more of an inference to the best explanation. Based on these other factors, it would seem that God is the best explanation as to why that cancer is gone. That's just kind of a difference between a classic standard God of the gaps versus what I think is a better way to argue, which is an inference to the best explanation. It's called abductive reasoning. I spent too much time on that I forgot your original question.
My original question, just before we get to that, I'm curious about your thoughts on the common rebuttal to usually things like consciousness, but other things that I've studied, like near-death experiences and anomalous experiences of consciousness, things like that, the argument would be, I mean, first, I agree that, God of the gaps is not the way to go. If we don't know something, we simply, that's it. We don't know it. It
Yep.
doesn't necessarily mean that something has to be the case. But equally, I find that, especially with consciousness, we easily spot God of the gaps in other arguments, but not in our own, where, we have our brains, which are matter, which are ultimately subatomic particles, which by a materialistic paradigm aren't conscious. And so we say that incredibly complex arrangements of this non-conscious physical matter comes together in a brain, something magic happens, and awareness is there. And they don't see that something magic happens is, to me, a God of the gaps. To say that it must therefore just be something that, that we will answer eventually, i.e. promissory materialism. So what do you think to the argument that every so-called supernatural or paranormal phenomena that we've believed unanswerable in the past has determined to be physical in nature? So therefore we can infer that something magical like consciousness, like a miraculous healing, etc., will also be physical by its best explanation,
Yeah.
by its best potential.
I would just the only thing that I would say about your description is the word all. So I wouldn't say that everything or all things in the past that we thought were supernatural have been shown to have a natural explanation. A lot of things have, right? I mean, I guess there was once upon a time where we thought thunder and lightning and volcanoes were all the divine, right? And we've discovered that that's not the case. So a lot of things have. It doesn't necessarily mean that all things will, because in a sense, that's kind of a natural causes of the gaps. So to say that there must be a natural cause and we'll figure it out eventually, that is kind of a natural cause of the gap. Again, I think it's better to do more of an abductive reasoning to say whether it's my mom getting healed from cancer or some sort of phenomenon that we're seeing, consciousness, whatever, and evaluate it carefully. And everything, should be evaluated on its own carefully and say, what's the best explanation? Is there a good natural explanation, or would it make more sense, better scope? It fits the evidence better, and that's how abductive reasoning works, that there is an intelligence behind it. And so I'm glad, that you've come to the conclusion that there is an intelligence behind things, including consciousness, because I think that is the best explanation. I remember your question now. It had more to do with evidence of Jesus. So I can segue into that if you'd like. Yep. So it begins, my understanding of things, or my, I guess, case for Christianity begins with arguments for the existence of God. So I'm more of a traditional or classical apologist in that sense. So I start with the fine tuning argument, moral argument, first cause arguments, those sort of things, to establish that there must be, or must be, the best explanation is that there is a creator behind the universe that's separate from the universe. So a supreme being, if you don't like the term God, some sort of supreme being. And then my second step then would be to then evaluate whose conception of this supreme being is most accurate. Because there's been all sorts of proposals as to what this supreme being is like. What I find remarkable is down through history, independently, all around the world, you have thinkers and people groups coming to this conclusion that there's some sort of supreme being. Um, but then there's different conceptions of what the supreme being is like. So you can ask the question, do the Muslims have the correct conception of what God is like? Did Plato and Aristotle have the more correct understanding of what the supreme being is like, or the Christian understanding of the supreme being? Is that more accurate? And then you could debate, well, how can we know? How can we know of all these different understandings of this supreme being down through history, which one is the most correct, the most accurate? And you might say, well, it'd be great if the supreme being, if he's out there, if he would tell us what he's like, right? If he would communicate to us what he's like, and then we would know, we could settle the debate. And of course, that's what a lot of these belief systems will claim, that they have some sort of revelation from God as to what he's like. And so then I think the question becomes, well, how do we know which of these so-called messages from God really are from him? And so that's how I kind of set up the table or set up the topic when it comes to evaluating Jesus. Jesus claimed to have a message from God, and part of that message was that he himself is God, that he's divine. He's one of the three persons of the Trinity. And so, why should we believe that his message was really from God? And that's a matter of, I think, the best way to evaluate that is to evaluate the historical evidence. And that is, I think, what your question is getting at is, how do I evaluate the historical evidence for Jesus? The things that he said, how do we know he really said these things? And his activities, right? His miracles, his resurrection. Because if those things are correct, if those things are historically accurate, let's say that Jesus did say those things and he really did perform those miracles, then I think that gives us a much stronger confidence or a much stronger certainty that his message really is true, that it really is from God. And so to evaluate this historical evidence, I actually, this might surprise you or your listeners, but I actually, in the last couple of years, have started pointing people to a book by Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Ehrman, but he is a
By
uh,
name, I'm familiar. Mm.
New Testament scholar at North Carolina University in Chapel Hill. He's an agnostic. Sometimes he, I think, refers to himself as an atheist, but most of the time when I hear him or read his stuff, he refers to himself as an agnostic. But he wrote a book, um, and the title of the book is "Does Jesus Exist?" Question mark. And in that book, it's a popular level book. He's written a lot at the academic level as well. He's a world famous New Testament scholar. But in this particular book, he goes through and um, covers all the historical evidence for Jesus. And I find that skeptics and non Christians are much more willing to look at the evidence if it's presented by somebody who isn't Christian themselves. Now, I disagree with that bias. Um, I don't think somebody should reject evidence or reject somebody's scholarship just because it comes from a Christian. So you can see this evidence, or this evidence, you can read how it's presented from Christian scholars, but I just find it to be a bit strategic to use Bart Ehrman's material. And in this book, he's addressing Jesus mythicists, people who say that there never was a Jesus of Nazareth. And so he lays out, I think, in like 300 pages, all the historical evidence for Jesus and the things that he said and the things that he did. And I find that to be very compelling. Now, I will say another good thing about this book, Bart Ehrman's book, "Did Jesus Exist?" Question mark, is he lays out the historical method. In other words, the method that professional historians use when it comes to evaluating some aspect of history, whether it happened or not. And I think that's worth the price of the book alone, just to better understand how historians evaluate something that happened or potentially happened 2,000 years ago. Because it's difficult, right? It's much different than researching what happened last week, which can be hard as well in this day and age with the internet and all this fake news, but it makes it even more difficult when we're talking 2,000 years. So he lays out how historians do that. And he points out that we have over 20 independent sources for the life and the ministry and the activities and the sayings of Jesus. 20 independent sources that we can compare and evaluate to see if they corroborate. And that's a huge task that increases the level of certainty when it comes to historians that something in history really did happen. If you have that many sources all saying, if not the same thing, then something very similar. So that's how I would start the conversation.
So, what would you say to the arguments that, the text of the Bible was written 2,000 years ago by individuals who were much less, I suppose, knowledgeable, I suppose, on the world around them than we are now, just by the years of our, technology, etc., and that over time the original texts have been taken by rulers of empires, adjusted to fit to keep people in check and to keep them under control, and then translated and translated again to the text that we have now, which, given those many revisions and the many years, are very unlikely to be anything like what the man himself would have actually said. And of course, we got difference in time and cultures as well, the way that people interpret and speak.
Yeah. Yeah, communication's always gonna be an issue, right? I mean, even just us today having a conversation, sometimes we miscommunicate or we misinterpret each other. My wife and I misinterpret each other. I mean, that's just part of the human condition to misinterpret. So, especially something that was written 2,000 years ago in a different culture, in a different language, we've got to work at interpretation. It doesn't come easy. I'm not going to be one of those that just says that the truths of the Bible just fly off the page, but it takes some work in interpreting it. I appreciate those scholars who concentrate on the original languages, the Hebrew and the Greek, and studying the culture of the first century to help us interpret, right? That's a difficult process. But there are people who specialize in this area. What you're talking about in terms of the text changing through the years, it's twofold, right? So there's one issue, and that is, if Jesus lived and did his 3 years of ministry, let's say sometime in the 30s, right? Early first century in the 30s AD, and then the New Testament was written more towards the middle or even end of the first century. And this is all according to Bart Ehrman. Okay. So I'm still just using his material. So if the New Testament was written decades later, right? Not centuries, but definitely decades later, the first issue is going to be, well, by the time that it was written down a few decades later, how do we know that that is accurate to what he did in the 30s, right? That's one issue. But then the other issue, and I think the one more that you're getting at, is after it was written down. So if you get to the end of the first century, the New Testament's all written, then how do we know that the New Testament, let's say at 100 AD, is similar to the New Testament that we read today? So 1900, 25 years later, approximately. And I think that second issue is the one more that you're getting at, and that's the field of textual criticism. Without having to go into that entire field and explain it all, I would refer back again to Bart Ehrman and the gentleman that Bart Ehrman got his PhD under. So Bart Ehrman got his PhD under Bruce Metzger at Princeton. And Bruce Metzger, you can look up his name. Your audience can look up Bruce Metzger and read about him. He's probably the most well-known textual critic working in this field of textual criticism in the 20th century. He was a Christian himself, but again, people shouldn't reject his scholarship because he was a Christian. He was a professor at Princeton for, I think, close to 50 years. But Bruce Metzger has this famous quote where he says, yes, there's been um, errors, copying mistakes that have worked their way into the New Testament. Nobody nobody says that there haven't been any copying mistakes. Everybody acknowledges that. The difference is, how can we take all the copies of the New Testament that we have, and they all have copying mistakes? Can we evaluate them and recreate the original? What degree of certainty can we get to in recreating the original New Testament? And according to Bruce Metzger, it's 99.5%. Based on all the copies that we have, and the copying mistakes are in different places, we can recreate the original New Testament with a degree of accuracy 99.5%. And the 0.5% that we're unsure about are things like spelling. Most of them are spellings. People go by different names: Peter, Cephas, different names for the same person. So, in terms of textual criticism, we have a high degree of certainty that we can trust that the text written towards the end of the first century is pretty much the text that we have today. But the other issue, like I said, is more of, if the events happened in the 30s, but the New Testament wasn't written until decades later, how do we know that that was accurate? And that's based more on the historical evidence than on textual criticism.
Sure. So, what about the so-called the Gnostic or lost Gospels, those of Thomas and Mary Magdalene, etc., that seem
Yeah.
to point more in the direction that I believe in terms of the metaphysics of how we are, as in we're all connected, we all effectively are God, but just the separations of him, as I say, waves in the ocean.
Hmm. Yeah.
And also, interestingly, just to add on to that, that also seems to be the main message of those who are alive today and continue to have things like near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences or religious experiences all seem to come back with that idea that we're all one part of whatever God would be, as opposed to God
Mm.
being a separate judge, I suppose, entity.
Yeah. Well, I think both can be true in a sense at the same time, in different senses, right? I don't believe in contradictions, um, but I do think there's a sense in which we are all one. So there's a sense in which we are connected with God. I would say he's a separate being. So I'm not a pantheist. I'm not a panentheist. I'm a theist. So I see God being separate from us in a sense. But there's another sense in which we are united with him in terms of being created in his image and as persons. So especially if you read John 17, it's called the high priestly prayer, and Jesus is praying to God the Father. So you've got the God the Son talking to God the Father there, and they're talking about their oneness that they have. But what's amazing there in that prayer is he talks about the oneness that we can have. And this goes back to what I said, I think is the meaning of life, that we were created to join the communion of the Trinity as persons, not as divine persons, but as human persons, to join that sort of fellowship, join that communion of loving relationships. So I think in that sense, the relational sense, we are all one, um, still being separate persons, separate beings. Um, but I've talked too long again. Forgot your original question.
Your thoughts on the lost gospels?
Yeah. So I think one of the difficulties that took place, by the time you get to the 300s, um, the Christian movement was struggling in the 300s to know of all these different documents and letters and gospels that were floating around, which ones were actually written by Jesus' disciples and which weren't. Okay. So I think that's the determination that really the church, the Christian movement, whatever you want to call it, that's one of the things they try to nail down in the 300s. And so you've got several councils, that start to meet and discuss these issues in the 300s and try to nail down, based on historical evidence, right, which of these various gospels and books and letters floating around were really written by Jesus's disciples and which ones were fakes. Pseudepigrapha is the technical name for it. And we can do that sort of research today, right? If we don't want to trust the councils, trust the Christian leaders during the 300s who did that research, scholars can do that sort of research today. And I think based on that type of research, both in the 300s and if you want to do it today, is the 27 books of the Protestant New Testament is I think what you'll come up with. There's some books with some of those 27 that have not as great of evidence that they're from the first century apostles than others. But for example, half of Paul's letters, there's not a scholar in the world that's going to dispute those. The other half of Paul's letters are going to be a little bit more disputed. Um, my point is just that some of the evidence is stronger for some of the books of the New Testament than others. And there's some which are debated even to this day. James, Hebrews is one that's debated. Is that really from the first century apostles or not? My point is, even if we're wrong about, let's say, some of those books that are on the fringe, it really wouldn't change our Christian belief system very much. Because worst case scenario, let's say, not worst case scenario, but one scenario, let's say, is we discover via scholarship next week that Second Peter and Hebrews and James are pseudepigrapha. They're not really written by they're fake books. So we throw them out. We still got 24 books that are rock solid and teach pretty much the same message. So if you just want to narrow yourself down to the books that virtually everybody agrees are from the first century apostles, let's say the top 10 or the top 15 of those 27, you're still going to have the same consistent core message or the core doctrines of Christianity. Some of these other books um, were easily discovered to be pseudepigrapha. So you mentioned some of them, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas. We've got documentation from the church councils in the 300s that were evaluating these various books. And the evidence is just so powerful to them and scholars today that these are fake books. They were written by other folks and given a false author to try to get people to accept them. And so there's just really strong evidence for that. Sometimes people will say, well, why did the church wait that long? Why did the Christian movement wait till the 300s? Why didn't they do that earlier? And there's several reasons for that. First of all, Christianity was illegal until 313. So it's kind of hard to get a bunch of scholars together and do this research when what you're discussing is illegal. Plus, prior to that, there was fairly standard agreement as to what books really were written by the first century disciples of Jesus. It wasn't until later where all these other fake books started popping up. As you can imagine, when Christianity was made legal, then there was more room for all these fake books to be popping up. So that's kind of the history of why the 300s becomes the century in which a lot of this is evaluated.
So going to a more directly accessible source of information, I don't know how familiar you are with the near-death experience literature.
I've read a little bit of Gary Habermas's work in this area. I
Mm-hmm.
noticed that you had it on your channel a while back.
He's very knowledgeable. He's a Christian scholar as well, and as he mentioned, near-death experiences aren't any evidence for any particular religion, but I find it interesting that people of all faiths have these, and they all come back with the same message. Many Christians come back with the same message that the core tenets of their religion is more of a not accurate to what they experience. So, most common core concept is the concept of God being a judge, and I can't recall any experience I've read from a Christian or from a Muslim, etc., who have come back and said that they were judged by anyone other than themselves. And they all seem to come back again, as I say, with the idea that they became one with God and that they were a part of God and that we all are a part of God, this sort of thing. And never have I heard, I don't think, any claim that, I felt like because I was an atheist, I wasn't accepted. I was told that it doesn't matter, and I came back with this feeling that, that I am connected. And so it's just very interesting that those who have these experiences, whether they subscribe to a religion or not, don't seem to come back with the kind of ideas that standard Christianity preaches in terms of the judge God and judgment day and heaven and hell. I mean, one of the most common reports is that there is no hell, although there are negative experiences. But generally, it comes back to, we are all love, and regardless. So I'm curious as to what you think about those as direct experiences in the modern time and how they relate to Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, this is definitely is an area that I've spent a lot of time looking into. So, I would have to take your word for it that the predominant experience coming back from them is as you've described. I don't know that to be the case. I'd have to look into it. But let's say I granted you that, right, for the sake of argument, that in fact that is the vast majority of the experience. Um, I wouldn't necessarily say that that would be at odds with Christianity because, again, my understanding of Christianity being that we were all created for that purpose, to be one with God, to be one in relationship, not God, not one in being, but one in communion. Um, it would make sense to me, or it would make sense or fit well with Christianity, I should say it that way, abductively, that those sort of feelings or experiences would take place, even if, let's say that person, because of their evil choices, would ultimately be separated from God. That initial maybe meeting with God would generate those sort of feelings or experiences.
Hmm. What do you make of the idea in that case of the life reviews that are very commonly reported in near-death experiences where, and I don't know how much you know about the panoramic life review, but it's a very common feature of near-death experiences where someone will, they say life flashes before your eyes, but that's a very simplistic idea of it, because these people, they re-experience, not from their own, not only from their own perspective, but from the people that they interacted with perspectives as well, of all the things that they did, how it affected themselves, how it affected the other people from a first person point of view. And they always come back and say, I wasn't judged, I was my own judge. My instruction was to learn from this and to grow as a human being, not, and I didn't feel like I was being slapped on the wrist by a parent or by a judge. It was my own self exploration of myself, if you know what I mean, which seems to be
Yeah.
at odds with the idea of a judge God.
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, if we're thinking of God as a loving judge, right? I'll continue using the analogy in a courtroom, let's say, of a loving judge who wants, even if somebody is going to be found guilty, um, they love that person and they want that person to understand what's going on. And especially if these people are coming back, right? These people are coming back to life. And again, I'm granting for the sake of argument that everything they're saying is correct. I just haven't looked into this myself, but let's say it is. I can envision, a loving judge wanting folks to know those things and understand those things, maybe to see and learn various aspects of life, especially if they're coming back to life, so that they can either make changes or um, do things differently, potentially.
As a way of helping their development towards God.
Yeah, and again, I want to be careful because I don't want to give any the impression, that according to Christianity, making yourself better, improving yourself is not going to help you become closer to God because we fall so short morally that the only thing that is going to fix your relationship with God is faith in Christ. But even a lot of Jesus's teachings were moral in nature, right? And there's things that we can learn from Jesus's teachings, how to better love people, how to be a better person. But a lot of his moral teaching is, like I kind of explained before with the Sermon on the Mount, is to show how high the bar of morality really is. So I'll just give you some examples, right? Famous examples from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said things in that sermon like, "You've heard that it said, 'You shall not kill,' or murder, but I say unto you that everybody who is angry with his brother has already committed murder in his heart." So this is just showing how high the bar of morality really is, because it's very easy. I mean, the vast majority of us have never murdered anyone, so we could think of ourselves as pretty good, people. I've never murdered anybody. I've never committed adultery. But Jesus raises the bar so high. He says, "Well, you've heard it said that you shouldn't commit adultery," and everybody's like, "Yeah, yeah, I shouldn't do that. I've never done that. I'm pretty good." And then Jesus kind of flips it upside down and he says, "I say to you that anybody who's looked on a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery in his heart." And it's like, oh my God, who hasn't looked at somebody with lust? We all have. And so all of us are guilty of committing adultery. And so it's kind of raising this bar to show us what moral perfection really looks like, so that we recognize that we fall short.